So I think we've got about 16 people in the waiting room now. So if I just meet everyone, do a very brief intro, and then obviously Ben, hand over to yourself.
Yeah, sounds good.
Super. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Southwest Lit Future of Cloud panel event. Today, I'm joined by a really experienced group of panelists and also facilitator, and we're going to be discussing a number of different topics underneath the Future of Cloud banner. We're actually running this across a few different meetup groups today. So it's our kind of Leaders in Tech meetup group, also the Bristol Cloud Native and DevOps group we run. So yeah, hand over to Ben, who's going to be our facilitator.
Smashing. Thanks very much for the introduction there, Marius. And it's great to see so many people on today's panel session. As Marius said a second ago, we've got an esteemed set of SMEs to take us through today's session. Obviously, we'll throw a couple of curveballs, so hopefully nobody's feeling too nervous at this moment in time. And invariably, we're really sorry that for those of you that have dialed in, we haven't been able to give you any pizzas or beers to make this a much more compelling event during today's sunny day. But I guess in terms of some of the topics that we're looking to cover as part of today's session, we're going to be touching on areas such as multi-cloud and whether or not it makes sense in the enterprise. But also when you kind of talk about public cloud moving into the future, what does that impact look like in terms of the organization, operating procedures, team structures, and what does enterprise IT actually look like moving forward when you have public cloud at its center of your strategy. And invariably, there's been a whole heap of conjecture around Kubernetes, serverless technologies, and whether you should bypass K8s and go straight to serverless technologies these days. So we'll kind of have a little bit of a conversation around that and just kind of get a sense from the panel as to the patterns and experiences that they're seeing in the industry, and generally what recommendations that they would take forward into their respective customers or even their own organizations. And then we're going to travel forward in time in the DeLorean, and we're going to wave our magic wand and we're going to put a couple of predictions together in terms of cloud computing and what we anticipate may happen in the next 5 years. As I said, I've been joined by an esteemed panel today. We've got Roy Lyons, Andy Bold, Dan Evans, and John Shanks. I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, starting first and foremost with Roy.
Good news about Tyrone, mate.
Hi, sorry. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Good to see you all. So yeah, my name's Roy Lyons. People describe me as many things, but the one that we'll use today is CTO for hire, I guess. So I help companies go through digital transformation and normally play the part of the interim CTO. I like to work with big companies and they're ones with the big problems. So past things being Pizza Hut, a few gambling companies, some banks. Currently, I'm a CTO at Unilever, so I'm helping the home care division, which is actually pretty popular at the moment. We sell bleach and cleaning products. That's pretty hot topic these days, and we're doing a big digital transformation there of all the websites, all our digital marketing, our professional business. Quite a big portfolio there. Worked with Ben previously on a couple of clients, and I was at Digital McKinsey for 4 years. I guess
Ben with Ralph the dog. Yeah. Next door.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Roy. And if we could just remind everyone that is dialing in to pop themselves on mute when you're participating, that'd be great. And thanks very much for being so kind and not saying anything rude about working with me, Roy. That was a good experience. We'll hand over to Andy. Andy, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Marius, for asking me along today. The last 10 years, I've been a consultant, specialising in helping businesses do digital transformation and cloud engineering and all kinds of fun things like that. Recently, though, I decided to hang up my contractor hats and become an honest 9-to-5 permanent employee. And I'm working as a senior engineer with Launch Darkly, which has been great fun for the first couple of months. And I'm looking forward to the conversations today.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andy. You've finally gone to the dark side. And I'm going to hand over to Dan Evans. Dan?
Hi, yeah, my name's Dan Evans. I've kind of been in the IT industry for about over 20 years. I've focused mainly on digital and agile transformations around the DevOps aspects. I kind of brushed past with Kubernetes in about 2016 when I was principal kind of DevOps engineer for Teradata in their Internet of Things. And ever since then, I've been kind of involved in going into organizations and kind of helping them get on the right track and getting the cultures correct in the companies. Yeah, more recently working with Andy a few months ago, and yeah, it's good to meet you all.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. And finally, if I could hand over to John. John, you want to give us a quick intro?
Hi, yeah, I'm John Shanks. I'm the CEO of Appia. We kind of design products for mostly for DevOps and development teams, automating around Kubernetes in cloud with a view for self-service. Development teams has always been the aim with best practices. Did a very similar thing, and obviously know Andy as well. We worked together at the Home Office of England and historically New York Stock Exchange, Betfair, and kind of all the very similar places that I think a lot of other people have probably worked to, I imagine, over the years. And now we kind of have a company that we're kind of doing and kind of transformation, and mostly around the newer container-based technologies to provide a bit of consistency around development teams, really.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Most appreciated. Cheers, John. So I guess in terms of the panel that we pulled together today, you can see that there's a mixture of industry, public sector, and also product-based companies. So we should be able to give a balanced view of what we're seeing in different verticals and experiences that we can practically bring to the table and share with everybody on the call today. I guess the first area that we're going to move in towards, though, is really around the kind of multi-cloud journey. So in my role at Contino, we work with a number of enterprise organizations that often have to embark on a multi-cloud strategy, either that's purely public or a mixture of private and public cloud strategies for a number of reasons, whether that's geographic dispersion, regulatory choices, etc. And I guess more often than not, sometimes given the engineering complexities and the skills that are required to help embark on those strategies, sometimes organizations can be seen to be biting off more than they can chew. And I guess when we move into this position of multi-cloud hybrid capability, does it really make sense? And I'm going to start with Roy, because I know that this is something that we chewed over a beer once or twice. But you know, first and foremost, what should organizations be making the jump to public cloud in the first place? And maybe if you can just open up on some of the complexities that brings to organizations in terms of engineering overheads or inefficiencies around cost as well.
It's a good question. Should you move to the cloud? I mean, the facetious answer is probably, and that's probably going to help you by moving to the cloud to some extent. It really, really does depend on the company. When I work with huge companies, it's a much bigger deal for them to even consider it. I actually think a lot of companies do it as a bit of a tick box exercise, and they'll just lift and shift into the cloud. Often that's not probably worth it. The real benefits of moving to the cloud are, of course, to enable a true digital transformation and in all the great cultural things we love, DevOps, you know, you build it, you run it, those kind of philosophies that you can't really do, or it's much harder to do outside of the cloud. The other context here, though, that's important is where you are in the world. Certainly, working for some banks in Eastern Europe, there's some really interesting challenges with working in the cloud. I worked with one where we were doing a transformation and looking to use Amazon, and then actually they were sanctioned by the US and couldn't use Amazon anymore for political reasons. So in the Western world, we're kind of privileged in that sense, I guess, that we can choose, should we use the cloud, should we not use the cloud? It's not the case worldwide. So we sometimes should think a little bit of our benefits that we have, and parts of the world don't necessarily have that. Should you use the cloud? Yes, probably. Some people need to use hybrid and still have on-prem and have some kind of cloud operations. Sorry, Ben, what was the second part of your question?
I must apologize. It was quite a long-winded one. So it's not like me. And then I guess when you embark on that public cloud strategy, and you have to have a divergent capability of, you know, GCP, Azure, AWS, or even, heaven forbid, a private cloud implementation, what are some of the engineering complexities that organizations need to be cognizant of?
Well, there's definitely a Spider-Man principle here, isn't there? That it's, you know, great responsibility and all that stuff. That it's you undertake this if you're going to really take that big challenge of running what could be a complicated distributed system in cloud or in many clouds. This is not a trivial undertaking, and probably something you shouldn't outsource. You probably need to keep that that differentiator within your business. A lot of the companies I work with have had actually technology come under their CFO for years, and therefore everything's about cost cutting, and that normally means, you know, fending it out to people who will do that development for you. I was going to name some client people, I won't. We all know the usual suspects that will come in for this kind of work, and you get a mixed bag. And if you're doing an incredibly complex digital transformation, you're probably going to regret doing that, and you may be better off staying monolithic and on-prem if you're going to actually try and outsource what is a complicated distributed system. So there is a huge responsibility for undertaking this, and I think you therefore need a strong team that understands the technologies you're going to use. As we say, multi-cloud is a different beast again, and there's a certain obsession within the fintechs of the world to do multi-cloud. I think the FSA kind of tried to push people along in that way, and that you know, compounds the problem even higher. So doing things in a multi-cloud environment, you know, more than trebles if you're going to do three, more than trebles the complexity of running a single system in a single cloud.
Yeah, I think if you kind of look at the industry as a whole and the opportunities for you to deploy in a private cloud an IaaS-based technology where you put an MSI file on some infrastructure is actually becoming more and more obsolete. And you're seeing ISVs and software vendors actually move their products into the cloud and being available on Amazon Marketplace and the various offerings from Azure and GCP. And actually, one could argue that more and more, if you are kind of pegged down in your own data center, you're not going to be able to leverage all of those differentiated capabilities, even from a kind of PaaS SaaS perspective as well. John, I guess if I could kind of turn to you, because invariably containers and Kubernetes and Docker and various other offerings in that space enable a layer of abstraction and portability. I'm just wondering if you can kind of share experiences around how containers can help with this multi-cloud journey and what capabilities they introduce to a number of organizations in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, historically, we did things, I guess I could give you some examples, but we had to do hybrid and multi, which was even more challenging. And I think a bit like Roy was saying, it always depends, on the situation they're kind of in and what's important to the business and what they're really trying to do. Is there an opportunity to modernize or not? Obviously, because that's going to be a bit of a deal breaker on like how multi-cloud you're really truly going to be if you're not even going to modernize the application. But when you do get to containers and the abstraction, there is an opportunity to kind of use containers, then it is much simpler to a degree. Obviously, the business logic itself may start relying on services from a specific cloud vendor that only that vendor has. So then if you're saying that that's not allowed or possible and you need full portability, then you're then moving away from the value of cloud back into operating these things yourself to then run it inside of the clusters you're building holistically. And then someone's got to manage, manage it, upgrade it, validate it, scale it. So you have all the complexity operationally back into your business, then kind of devaluing what the value of cloud was supposed to bring, I guess, to a certain extent. So yeah, I guess it can work well to a point, and then obviously I think there has to be a bit of commitment on, what do you want to consume and why? What service makes the most sense? Can you change the business logic quickly? Because in theory, the application should be always being iterative anyway. So therefore, it's not necessarily a big deal to report to a different library, to a different cloud vendor if you need to. A lot of the problems tend to be network, coupling services to networks that need to be across all the different clouds and, all the traditional things that go around it that end up being quite difficult. But the application tends to be usually reasonably the simple bit to change when you've got an engineering team on it all the time anyway. But yeah, that's kind of my experience.
Yeah, I guess based on my kind of industry experience, when I've spoken to organizations, generally the first question I ask is how often do you actually move your applications in your own data centers, right? Because there's this obsession of having, cloud neutrality and ability to move things at a flick of a switch. in the same way that you might move your energy supplier. But more often than not, organizations don't move their applications that often, and invariably, right, you're kind of as tied down as your lowest common denominator, which more often than not, as you said, is networking and actually data. So if you've got a desire to move petabytes of data associated to web applications in minutes, that's just not going to be feasible. I guess, Dan, based on, sorry, was a quick,
can I add,
someone's jump in.
I mean,
Yeah, go on, Roy.
You go to these companies and they're obsessed with portability between cloud. And actually, if you ask the question, how did your last backup and restore of your database go? And it probably didn't go very well in these places. Do you think you'll be able to kind of essentially back up and restore your cloud? Probably not, right? Because you can't handle what is a much simpler problem, actually, of backup and restore databases that we've been doing for decades. Actually, few people do the equivalent of portability within multi-cloud. So if you can't do your database, you ain't going to be able to do your cloud. So I think and there's almost a theoretical obsession with making things portable without actually any real proof point or need or even capability to be able to even think about doing it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Dan, I guess we touched on one or 2 points, and I think some organizations often get hung up on a single pane of glass view of being able to manage and administer that kind of enterprise IT estate. But I guess from my experiences, there are capabilities that the cloud providers can provide to you in order to govern that kind of ecosystem, if you will. I guess based on your experiences, how have you kind of governed a multi-cloud ecosystem and made sure that you've got a balanced kind of capability across your IT portfolio?
It can be really difficult, to be fair. You're talking about not just from a technical point of view, but an organizational structure that you might have to be contending with, where you've got different cloud provider teams in it. So there's a bigger kind of piece of work, I always think anyway, is to look at the organization structure and make sure there's that collaboration across different platforms. Infrastructure as code has got to be first and foremost, to be honest. I like you've mentioned, I kind of am always a bit perturbed when people are really insistent on having this cloud agnostic kind of viewpoint. And when you look at their kind of what their data centers have been for the last 10, 15 years, and what resilience and what they think the resilience they're trying to get out of that. So you have to have very strong engineers in this. There's no question about that. And like as we mentioned before, networks. But yeah, key is having a very strong engineering team that is religious with infrastructure as code, religious around security first practices and validation as part of that build pipeline for those things. And yeah, like I said, I've been to many organizations and there aren't many companies that can really do it well, to be fair. So at the back of my mind, I'm always kind of looking, is this a real need or requirement for the business? Because it's, when I try and go into organizations, I'm looking to kind of reduce technical drag, so to speak. I'm looking kind of to reduce that kind of all those technical innovative things that have kind of grown organically, like the shadow IT world. So trying to bring those in and trying to drive a real sense of control is one of the key aspects. And I think the migration services that most of the CSPs provide now are kind of enable you to get back into a primary CSP. Well, that would be my goal anyway. So.
Yeah, I think so you made a good point, right, in terms of primary backup, who's my secondary CSP, and John made a really, really good point earlier in terms of leveraging higher level services in order to kind of differentiate yourselves from the competition. The more and more you move higher up the stack in the CSP, the more that kind of heavy lifting gets taken off you, and you kind of redivert your resources to focus on the things that really make a difference in your business. And I guess from experience, I just kind of look at Andy in this regard. I mean, when you embark on a kind of multi-cloud strategy, or you're looking at one or two cloud providers, what are some of kind of the pitfalls that you've seen in industry, and what advice would you give to organizations that are typically looking to embark on this type of journey?
I think you've got to start from being realistic with your expectations. One problem I've seen in the past, and apologies to any architects on the call, I don't mean you, you're all obviously smart people, you come to this session today. But I've seen in the past architects who are distant from the technology and the teams making it a requirement. They've got to do multi-cloud because we can't be tied to one provider. We've got to have resiliency, and not being aware of the challenges in doing that. So my advice would be set your expectations accordingly. This is going to take a long time, and you've got to get good at one cloud provider first, because you're not just getting good at using the technologies that provider is giving you. You're building the organizational processes and the team structures and the engineering practices at the same time. It's a lot of change. But once you've got it working good for one provider, you can then say, okay, who's going to be my second provider? Something else you've got to consider is the cognitive load on your teams. If you've got one set of engineers and you're expecting them to be experts in AWS, GCP, and Azure, you're going to find that they're going to be good at all three probably, but they're not going to be experts in all of them. And you're going to need experts when things go wrong, because things do go wrong. So you're going to have to start thinking about the size of your teams as well. From a technical challenges point of view, you're going to start getting issues around latency and resiliency, ironically, once you get to this multi-cloud separation. Because now you've got to start thinking about, well, if I've got data here in AWS and I've got data over here in Azure or GCP, which one's the right one? Which one's true? How do I know that these replicas are up to date? What happens if somebody goes here and there's a change just been made over there? There's lots of things to consider, and you're not going to solve all these problems quickly. And you're not going to solve all these problems by telling the engineering teams just lift and shift into the cloud. I was speaking to a friend last night, actually. He's having this exact problem right now. He's in charge of a project that was developed on one cloud provider, but the strategic direction for the business is with another. And he's been instructed to move it across to the other provider, and the architects who are in a different country, they're saying it's just a lift and shift. Why is it so difficult? But they're not appreciating all that complexity under the hood, which is different storage technologies, different database technologies, and so on and so forth. So it's not easy. It's not, we call it all the cloud, but it's different types of cloud.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I think your advice there in terms of, it's almost like we've worked together previously, Andy, but your advice of recommending to go with one cloud provider and do that really, really well, first and foremost, is absolutely the right thing to do. The analogy that I've been using with one or two customers of late is don't get stuck in cloud purgatory, where you're in this awkward position of moving dev and test workloads into a public cloud provider, but you don't yet have all of the operational resilience and compliance controls that are fit for purpose in a production state. So I think it's always important, right, to take that first use case all the way to production to make sure that you're actually kind of winning the hearts and minds, but also placating any concerns around operational risk, compliance, particularly in highly regulated industries. I guess just to kind of open this up to the panel. So we've touched on a couple of points around higher level services, portability of applications, multi-cloud, and the complexity that brings. And some of the customers that I've dealt with previously, they've always think that they have to solve this problem or a problem that is being prevalent at that time in public cloud. But about 6 months down the road, that problem very quickly gets solved by the CSP. And do you think that in the next kind of couple of years, we're going to see the likes of Azure Stack, Anthos, and Outposts become more prevalent in order to, bring down the barrier around this confusion, or wall of confusion, ironically, around multi-cloud in a hybrid setup? I'm just interested to see what appetite you think organizations are going to take in terms of these solutions. Feel free to jump in, Andy.
I'll jump in. I think these are all great services that help you make that first transition. That when you first approach this and think, I'm going to move my data center workloads into the cloud, it's just a lift and shift. It's going to help with that. But it lets you learn that maybe it's not just a lift and shift. Maybe if I re-engineer the architecture or re-engineer the application to work better with the cloud provider, I can still keep things running in my trusted place, what was my trusted place while I develop these services in the cloud. And I think it makes that journey easier. So instead of having to think about things like the physical connections between your data center and the cloud and your security around those connections, things like Outpost and Stack can handle that for you and integrate with your existing ID provision that you've got, whether it's Azure AD or something else, for example, and just make it easy. It just lowers that barrier to entry.
Yeah, great. Is there anything that any of our esteemed colleagues on the panel want to add? John, I can see you've come off mute.
Yeah, I was just thinking through actually even the multi-cloud thing as we were kind of talking, that actually in some of the companies, multi-cloud is about the choice of which cloud for which workload, as opposed to I'm going to make this application work across all providers. So I guess it depends on like whether you need a competitive advantage in your business to be able to say, well, actually, we can be quite competitive within the business if we can choose the cheapest, because we've maximized the fact that we're looking at it more from a commercial aspect of, if I can run this over here and commit to this cloud to run this service, that's fine if I go all in with it on that service. But I also do have choice to then maybe move new services into another cloud provider if I want to too. It's not about necessarily distributing it everywhere all at the same time and then trying to kind of abstract it all away. I just kind of forgot to mention that, because actually we have use cases where people do that, and it's more about choice rather than distributing workloads. But I think a similar thing with on-prem, and especially from going from about 4 years ago when we did Kubernetes on bare metal and it was an absolute nightmare, that it does help obviously to have abstractions for these things. So having some form of kind of modernized API abstraction where all the modernized tools can kind of talk to something, and there's a lot of community backing around them in the open source community, does make life a lot easier if you are going to obviously think about portability to a certain degree. So I think just on that aspect in terms of engineering, and then also the teams and how you want your teams to work, and if you're trying to get a consistent outcome, you know, especially if you've got hundreds of developers, then actually getting consistency across those hundreds of developers is quite a huge efficiency saving. So then it does become important when you're at scale, because you're going to reap the benefits, even though you're kind of getting potential lock-in. But I think that's sometimes just a trade-off, and you have to just figure out what's important to the business really, operationally or cost-wise and time and things like that.
Yeah, I think if your engineers are good enough to get you into public cloud, they'll be good enough to get you out of it as well, right? So if you empower them with the right tooling, the right capabilities, and you know, reskill them with the right education and those sorts of things, then that's going to be the right decision for your business. And there were 2 points I just wanted to raise as well. So to those of you that have joined today's session, if there are any questions that you want to raise at the back end of the call, then feel free to message me directly. I guess just in terms of, in the interest of time and some of the topics that we've touched on, we've gravitated a lot towards the higher level services in the CSPs, and you know, that kind of rips up the rule book of how the organization should be functioning, right? Because you don't really need as many people in the sysadmin space to patch and maintain servers if you're moving up that kind of higher level of abstraction. I guess I'll kind of pose this one to Roy, because we've spent many times in an atrium drinking coffee and discussing what organizations should look like in the future. But you know, as we move to this kind of higher level abstraction, and you know, the CSPs doing a lot of the heavy lifting, are we kind of talking that this is the end of the road of the traditional DevOps engineer, or you know, what does the future of the IT operating model look like in your view?
Well, I mean, I would say clearly no, right? I mean, am I the oldest here on the panel? Maybe Andy, maybe we'll see. But we've been around. A lot of us been around for a while, and you still, everything's a high level service. I mean, if you ask Google, when they were building Google, they were doing it with Lego and bits of, you know, kit that they were making themselves. And then you end up with a cloud, and Amazon presumably did the same thing and have built this high level abstraction. And you can think the same with software as to how we've just built these layers and layers and layers. The thing is, it just, as the complexity of the underlying stuff gets reduced, you can just do more stuff with the cloud, and therefore the complexity there increases. So actually your opportunity opens and the complexity remains. It's just a complexity in a different place now. And so we're still going to need to have people who know how to deal with these big infrastructural problems. Now you can draw the line as to whether they're actually, you know, building servers or just configuring Kubernetes into clusters. But there's still an engineering decision that's made as to wherever we are there. And the further we go up, the more we can kind of do. I have a sense that we're going to become more distributed again. And so therefore the complexity gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think you just have this, you still need, well, whatever we call them, but they're engineers of some form, to be able to handle these big complex problems as to how do we do more with the technology we have.
Yeah, it's interesting. The likes of Amazon, right, have released AWS Honeycomb in the last few weeks, which is, you know, that kind of really simplistic web app capability, which someone from the business could quite easily configure. I guess, John, you mentioned about 4 years ago putting Kubernetes on bare metal. I'm just curious, you know, as you've seen the kind of high-level services and PaaS-based EKS, GKE, AKS offerings come to market, has that kind of changed your thinking around how organizations should be structured from an infrastructure perspective?
It's a hard one to answer, like, holistically, because obviously, again, it depends on organization to organization. I think that the difficulty with cloud is where their business model stops. So they're very good at, like, providing, you know, I guess their economies of scale are based around having small product teams. So to kind of design API abstraction services that kind of solve a very specific problem in a very specific way. And they don't tend to have a product workflow over the top of it. So they kind of, like, even though they've got the UE, or they kind of leave it down to the community or down to the engineers to decide how, out of all these different APIs, are you going to construct it for your engineers, and how does a team work with all of this? Never really gets answered. So it's kind of like passed back to the business or passed back to the community, go and figure it out. So in that sense, in terms of, like, traditional self-service, can somebody just get going with a really low barrier for entry for a team without the expertise of cloud? At the moment, no, because it's not. It requires somebody with knowledge to stitch it all together to get a desired outcome. And I think unless they start entering that space, and I don't know whether they will or they won't, I guess it depends on their business model of whether it's worth it or not in terms of cost, or whether they just leave it like this and just keep kind of nailing out these services. I think you'll always need it, but it's quite a hard, you know, I guess that's where companies like us have come along and tried to stitch things together and get a bit of a better self-service workflow and do all these things, because you see the repetition of what everybody ends up trying to do, you know, repeatedly in different pockets with the same tools, because they're never products, they're always tools. And so, yeah, it gets quite complicated. So I'm not sure. There's benefits, but then it always kind of slightly improves, but then there's always still a requirement to kind of come along and still knit it together. So, yeah.
It's interesting, right? So that kind of, and Andy mentioned about not offending architects at the start of this call, and I'm probably going to do it myself now, but that obsession in the enterprise of having a blueprint of what a system should look like from many, many years ago when we did pens and paper activity is naturally traversing itself into public cloud. When in actual fact, a lot of those blueprints already exist in terms of the AMIs and the types of servers and the models that you could potentially use, and invariably a whole community of open source technology that people can leverage a lot quicker. And I guess, Dan, just a kind of question for you. So there were a couple of announcements at reInvent a few years ago around ECS Fargate and subsequently EKS Fargate and numerous other kind of higher level services where you literally don't have to do anything were released by the CSPs. I guess what do you think some of the considerations are that organizations should take around cost control, right? Because if it's not done correctly, this stuff can become very expensive very, very quickly. So what are your views on that regard?
Yeah, it can always be expensive, and I think that all comes down again to your engineering. If you've intrinsically built up a team that's precise about how they go about things in terms of maintainability, in terms of performance, you know, not just the kind of functionality bit, and you drive efficiencies that way, then by moving over to this way of working, you can really drive out those efficiencies. Costing and controlling, look, it's kind of easily done, right? How many times do you go in and a developer is using a 4XL to do some unit tests because it's quicker? You know, there has to be some kind of controls around that and good governance to get the cost efficiencies out of cloud, and that's something that people typically forget. The kind of lift and shift was for a lot of people over the last couple of years has been that was it. They moved it in, they did their lift and shift. You go and look at the way they do performance testing, and they're still driving it through volume of scale across their pre-prod environments, and you're there going, no, you've got to drive performance testing is around cost optimization nowadays, not about finding the right instance type or the right number of CPUs to get that scaling sweet. So being able to put a kind of control on those things is largely through in AWS the IAMs and so on and so forth, and making sure that you're using kind of common sense instance sizes, but also there's a lot of engineering know-how you need to bring to the table, and if you're not well versed in kind of cloud engineering as such, you can find yourself working in a kind of the old kind of data center way of working, and that's where costs are very significant. So a lot of places I go in, the kind of costs are astronomical, and you could save costs. Like my record is about 33% savings basically on what was over £1 million, but there are ways and means to do it, and I think that's part of you making sure your engineers are kind of versed in that, not just functionality, but actually in that true altruism of efficiency and drive. And so yeah, that for me it's kind of taking those engineers and making sure they're on that journey as well, and understanding it's not about functionality, it's about all those characteristics.
Yeah, it kind of always amazes me when people build their business cases to move public cloud predicated purely on infrastructure, right? They don't look at all of the ancillary softer elements. I know, Roy, I think there's probably going to be something around SRE here, I've got a feeling, but is there something you want to touch on?
There is something I want to touch on. It's not actually that. I think there's an interesting thing here, though, that cost isn't always the thing, right? So certainly some of the customers I work with the money isn't the problem, it's the speed. And so you talk about using something like a Fargate or, and it's expensive compared to say rolling your own in some way, hosting Kubernetes yourself, probably on EC2 instances, probably the cheapest way, but it's complex to do that. But you could use Fargate as an accelerator. Almost all acceleration costs money. And as a business, you have to decide, do you want that? Do you need the acceleration? That might be paying for Fargate, but it might be hiring, one of us, or hiring people that are a little bit more expensive than the norm. And because you're going to get an acceleration, or going to one of the big four, they will definitely accelerate with you, and they'll have the oomph to be able to do that. So I think we humanly think, oh, it's all about reducing the cost, and we should really spend a lot of time making sure we're being efficient, because that's how we actually run our own lives. But the businesses don't always need to, and they actually want to. It's much better for them to get out there quickly and be able to iterate fast than actually worry about the cost of something. So I think there's a facet that we need to consider there. And I think a lot of companies are changing from that. And like I alluded to earlier, that technology used to come under the CFO very commonly in big business. And that is changing now. And they are now having, their CIOs, their CTOs and their COOs to kind of have a bit more of a balanced view as to what makes a difference for our business. How do we use technology as an enabler and not just look at it as a cost? Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think the pennies and pounds business case, as I said, is often forgotten about now, and or is kind of the focal point rather. And the things around time to market, velocity, concept to customer, all those things that actually really matter in today's world, because if you're not delivering value in 3 months, you may as well stop doing it. I guess we're just in terms of time check, we've got 20 minutes left and a couple of other questions to get through, gents. But I guess we'll kind of move to the third area of our conversation. So, IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, containers or serverless. There's a numerous multitude of kind of technology choices that you can make when you move to public cloud. But I guess for me is, how do you future-proof your business, right? There's a couple of points that we've spoken around, lock in, making sure you use high-level services, having your engineers empowered. There's a whole heap of stuff to consider. I guess I'll start with John in this regard, but do you see that containers are still the kind of go-to solution for a lot of organizations in terms of that speed to market, consistency of delivery, and kind of, the API economy, if you will?
I guess that depends on who the user is. So if you to speak to a developer, I imagine they're going to go and choose serverless most of the time, because I think it appeals better to that type of persona, and it's probably designed more for that persona from the beginning. It's not really an infrastructure approach. It's a kind of code approach, really, but then containers, I guess, are massively adopted, but it's still. Would you say they're a developer tool? Probably kind of not. Like maybe they're kind of on the bridge between kind of like infrastructure and development. And Kubernetes isn't really, again, a developer focused tool. It's quite infrastructure heavy, it's quite operationally heavy. And so, yeah, I think most people will probably, most developers, if they're given the choice, will probably go for something simple like Cloud Run, or something that's tangible to them, or Lambda that they can kind of understand and how they're going to design their service for. And I think some other developers will go for containers if it's easy to test and iterate locally, and they're kind of more in that, and they want to kind of pull down services, and it depends on the application type and what they're kind of trying to do. So I think it kind of really does probably depend on kind of who's pushing it for what reason, and who's kind of solutionizing in relation to what they're trying to do, and who's involved in all those conversations. But yeah, I guess from a cloud perspective, with containers, a bit like with VMs, there's going to be a natural economics move for the cloud providers to start charging in a different way. Because obviously, if I can charge per pod, and at the moment I'm charging per VM, because you can host your own, it's in yours, and you're basically got a run cost, then they're going to get more economic benefit by abstracting away the infrastructure to create new charge points. So it's like, well, obviously their desire will be to kind of keep abstracting, because then I can get more for the buck at the end of the day on the capex expenditure that they've made, which is like, well, now I could charge per pod, per service, per, you know, and it's like creates new charge points for them. So I can kind of see them trying to abstract away, even with EKS at the moment, and more of that Fargate model, and promoting that more so you don't really run the infrastructure, so it kind of has a better economic model for them.
Yeah, I think there was certainly some good points that you raised there. I guess in terms of Andy, I'll come to you in this regard, right? But where you talk about containers and serverless, do you sense that organizations are making a shift to serverless technologies, or are they somewhat hesitant?
I think they're hesitant, and I think a lot of it comes down to not being familiar with the technology. So there's some hesitancy. I don't quite understand how this is going to work. This thing that just runs once, does a thing, and then goes away, compared to this thing that runs on a server which is a model I've been using for the past 20 years, and I'm very happy with that. So I think there's a lack of familiarity with the options that are available. And containers are the easiest parallel to use at the moment, to say, well, okay, you've got this thing which is kind of like a virtual machine, but really isn't, and everything's encapsulated within it. It's got a bit of an operating system, it runs some stuff, and it runs all the time. Versus, I run this function once, it does a thing, and then goes away. I think the other challenge with serverless, though, is the complexity of it. Because what you're building in a way, in some ways, is a distributed monolith with latency. You've got all these things that are now running independently of each other up in the cloud, and they're all talking to each other. And you've got to start thinking about things like, well, what do the security boundaries look like? How do I make sure that this right thing talks to that left thing, and only those two things can talk to each other? So it adds a lot of complexity, and I think that scares people away from it as well, because it feels like you're losing a lot of control. Obviously, we all know there's ways around that. There's ways you can engineer these software functions and services to be secure and to only do the right things in the right way. But you've got to go along a learning curve to get to that understanding. And it can be quite a steep curve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the serverless area specifically, I think to tie a couple of these topics together. So John mentioned the cost economics of cloud, but actually the way that you're charged for MIPS on the mainframe is no different from how you're charged for consumption in AWS. And it's quite an interesting paradigm that we've just taken a technology and charged it a particular way for 30, 40 years, and we're going to do that in the public cloud. So that whole kind of scale of economics. And I guess there's always been some challenges with serverless and startup kind of warm up time and those sorts of things, which have been fixed a little bit in the last few releases. We've seen some customers, liberate their mainframe data, for want of a better phrase, right, by using serverless technology and increasing the throughput of transaction extraction from 50 transactions per second to thousands of transactions per second, right? So that whole ability to get more real-time information from your data within your own organization is twofolded. And I guess we're kind of approaching the top of the hour, and there's one question that I think this really kind of quite interesting, and Roy and Dan, I'll have you both answer this if possible. But what do you think holds organizations back in kind of really unlocking business value in their technology estates when it kind of comes to public cloud? And I'll start with Roy.
I mean, just before we move on to this, I'm gonna be the one person who's a big fan of serverless, actually. So I think we've had a bit of a downplay on the serverless game. I think they both exist for different purposes, personally. So I think Lambdas are incredibly good if you're building microservice kind of architectures yourself. If you want to run an application or something that someone else has built, that's often better done in a Docker container. So anyway, I think they're different horses for courses on these things. They're not a competition. They're used in different ways, personally. But your question. What's holding you back? Well, I think the companies are holding them back themselves. So the problem with a lot of the companies I work with, the bigger enterprise companies, they have almost they're almost like an echo chamber of themselves, and they've brought people through, and these people have stayed with these companies for often decades, and have done what they've always done. Now, this doesn't mean people don't want to change, but there's been guardrails built around everything to stop change almost, and so it's really, really hard to suddenly just break all of that away. That's been built over, as I say, possibly decades of process, probably for good reason in the past, actually, but it's like probably less useful these days. So when we do these digital transformations that I end up doing, it's very hard to do that within the company. We tend to build the organ a bit outside of the body. That doesn't mean it does have to get put back into the body later on, but by working a little bit piloty and a little bit innovation labby on the side, you can kind of show the benefits of this stuff. I think it's very easy to naysay everything, in fact, and if you've built a culture that works in a certain way and you're going against it almost everybody, then it's very easy to naysay, and there's always a reason why you can or can't do anything. But if you can show the business value outside first and quickly, so I think the key is to really, when we talk about the acceleration, it's that don't skimp on the saving here. Let's get this fast and get this thing done in a few months so we can show actually the business value of doing this different approach. Actually, then everyone sits up and you engage with the C-levels, and they don't really care so much about the politics that's happening. And if they see a much better way to drive the business value, then that will just get fed and grow. And rightly so. And if it doesn't, if it doesn't work and it shrivels away, then that's a good test as well that's happened. Then the challenge remains of getting that organ back into the body, which is often a real challenge. But I mean, you have to do that then to scale that out throughout. And I've done that a couple of times in the past. That's the harder part. It's very easy to show the business value quickly, a bit harder to get it more broadly adopted. But that's the full journey that the company makes. And it's that itself will take decades. And probably by the time you've done it, there's a new way that we should be doing everything again. So it's, the new becomes the old.
That's exactly it, right? Though it's the speed of delivery and the speed of change. You've got to build momentum really quickly, or what today's news is tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper. I love that analogy of the echo chamber. It sounds like a great episode of The Twilight Zone. Dan, I'm going to pass to you. If there's anything additional on top of what Roy mentioned that you'd like to share.
Yeah, no, businesses are usually getting in the way of themselves. I'll just echo that with what Roy said. The amount of times you go into an organization and for a digital transformation, and the issue is not the dev side, not the engineering side, but the actual kind of the portfolio management, the actual business stores, the processes, So I always find it very interesting when I go into an organization and I start advocating changes on the business side, and people are going, well, you're IT. And you're like, no, you have to go on this journey. You're a technology company now, whether you like it or not. There's ways to facilitate this, and I think that can be quite challenging. And I think the way the businesses have evolved over the last 70 years, and the project management processes that have been driven out, there's a real cultural change now in companies driven around more product management, more kind of long-term investment rather than projects just delivered and done. So the people are going on that journey, and you're starting to see that at kind of very senior levels where people have kind of come up and kind of understand that premise. So it's still very prevalent, and it's still that old way of working mentality that you're delivering by dates. And again, to highlight what Roy said before, it's not always about the cost. There's ways around managing the value streams and driving real true business values and indicators. And so right now I see the biggest thing is that transformation. It's always viewed as an IT world issue, and the minute you start kind of address that, well, actually the way you as a business are driving these projects and initiatives are causing a lot of the disruption, a lot of the problems that we see, then I think you can start engaging and understand it. Like you say, at the C level, once you kind of can demonstrate it and show some of these metrics and kind of visualize them, I think businesses get on board. But yeah, there's always that kind of that moment of go, hang on, isn't he an IT guy? What's he doing telling us how to run our business? And that's the interesting thing. So yeah, I firmly agree with what Roy's saying.
That's the thing I've often found, is that it's always mapped back to technology indicators and KPIs, right? But not business ones. So, you know, how many hearts and minds have we got? What's our customer churn looking like? Have we acquired more customers? What's the monetary value that we've generated associated to this? So yeah, it's an interesting paradigm. And we've had some questions come in, but I just wanted to kind of close off on this with the panel, and then we'll try to get a couple of other questions from the audience. We're at a 10-minute time check as well. So you've got 2 minutes to respond each, gents, on this question. And it's quite a travel into the future with Doc Brown and Marty McFly. But, you know, if you were to fast forward in time and, you know, find yourself 5 years from now, what do you expect to see to be something, you know, 2 of the biggest changes in the kind of cloud industry? And I'll start with Andy and just see, and we'll move across the panel from there.
So I think there's 2 things, one which is quite cloudy and one which isn't quite as cloudy immediately. The first one is KubeFed. So KubeFed is federated Kubernetes clusters. It's version 2, it's approaching beta stage. I think we're going to see the cloud providers operationalize that and make it easy. So you can stand up a Kubernetes cluster on any cloud provider, talking to a Kubernetes cluster on any other cloud provider. And that starts to solve that multi-cloud problem. Now, the second one is WebAssembly. So we've got WebAssembly, which is downloading binaries to devices to run things locally. It's almost like full circle back to running things locally on a PC. But you can deliver things over the web to run on these devices, which are as quick or quicker than some laptops these days, to do things locally. So the reach of the cloud providers and into everybody's pocket. And I think that's going to make it a really interesting dynamic going forward. And I think security teams are going to have a lot of sleepless nights over it.
It's like the episode from Silicon Valley and Pied Piper taking over the world. John, I'll kind of turn to you and see if you've got any comments and points you want to raise.
Yeah, I kind of imagine the serverless / container thing converging into some level of abstraction over the years, as obviously it become problematic when you're bridging different things. So I imagine somebody will end up trying to create some level of abstraction where you can't really tell. And I think most things are going to be data. So I think there'll be a lot more data-driven businesses as it becomes more accessible, getting answers out of questions from data, and kind of all the different workflows. And you kind of have things like Kubeflow at the moment, but I imagine all that will kind of mature over the years, and much more accessible, and different technologies that make it a lot easier. So I just think it'll be like a natural conversion over the years. I'm not quite sure what will go on with, obviously, the whole Google attacking the other cloud providers kind of thing. That's kind of interesting just to watch, but I don't know where that's going to go really. But it's quite good just to watch from afar, the fight for the clouds with each other. So yeah, I'm not sure what will happen there, but yeah, I think that's probably what will happen in terms of just technology as a general.
Yeah, I agree. The cloud wars will be an interesting one to watch. Dan, any kind of views from your side?
What you've just mentioned is one of the key things. That there's going to be a huge battle with China, and so I think you're going to start seeing a lot more kind of Eastern countries companies coming in and really disrupting the kind of the big 3 as it is at the moment. You got Alibaba coming through, and the Chinese market is huge. It's like a quarter of all the cloud in the world. So make no mistake, there's going to be price wars going on at every level, and they're going to make it as easy and seamless to kind of migrate your services over to them. So there's that aspect. And so again, going back to round it up from the multi kind of cloud, if you focus on one, I'm pretty sure the other competitors are going to be working out how to migrate your stuff for you. So hold tight with that. The other thing was mainly about the kind of what we mentioned before, again, with the Azure Stack and the AWS service. I've forgotten the name of the AWS service, but anyway, But that with at the moment with COVID-19, with the offices, you know, kind of people not needing offices now, but needing hubs. I think there's going to be land available for people to kind of go off and create their own kind of market for getting the infrastructure into kind of some of the data centers themselves, and providing kind of a kind of on-premise Azure kind of services across the board. So I think that's going to be an interesting reseller kind of platform as well. So those areas are quite interesting, and I think the cost of cloud is going to drop considerably in that period.
Yeah, I like the mirroring there between the industrial revolution and the digital revolution. It'll be interesting to see what will really happen there. And we'll circle back around, and we'll finish as we started. And Roy, if you want to kind of top and tail with your views.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's always you look to the past to look to the future, right? And I think if you think of the way technology's gone, we started with mainframes, which are almost centralized kind of cloud model almost, but centralized on mainframes. And then we distributed out to servers, and now we've gone again to a kind of centralized model in the cloud. And it's I would put money on it will decentralize again in some way. I actually think legally this will happen. There'll be some demonopolization legislation that will mean the cloud providers will have to break themselves up, like this always seems to happen to the companies that become too successful and too monopolies. The stuff that's going on in the States at the moment, actually, with the big four, it's likely to happen with the cloud providers, and they'll have to figure out how we break it up, and then probably standardization will come out of that, actually, which will allow you to move between different vendors, because you need to maybe have the anti-competition laws or something into play. So I think there'll be a redistribution of the cloud, if that makes sense. And maybe where Andy's talking, that likely too in my head, it'll push back out down to us and the devices that we have. We have lots of computing and resource power on us walking around the streets. So we can just figure out how to make the internet a bit bloody better. Obviously, it's held up today okay for us at least, but if we can figure that out, then we can redistribute it all back to our phones again, or whatever, or our brain computers, or whatever we have in the future. The other thing I think that's going to be a big problem, I think we have big data now, but I think we're going to have bigger data, or whatever you want to call that. We need 10 times more data. I think the latest estimates in 5 years is that we'll be having 5 times as much data in just 5 years' time, and this will carry on exponentially. And I don't think we've really solved that very well in the cloud. Yes, we can handle the scale of the data, but we can't back it up very well. We can't restore it very well. If you lose it, you've lost it pretty much in your big data world. And the prevalence of AI and all of the cool stuff that we all need to get on our CVs means that everyone's going to be getting more and more data. So I think that needs to be solved, probably linked with redistribution of the cloud, I would guess.
Yeah, I think just on kind of bookending some of those points, I think the whole data piece and the democratization of it, and other organizations making money off my data probably upsets me a little bit. And I think more and more that the decentralization of, thanks, Roy. The decentralization of that ownership back into the power of the user, and kind of bigger kind of use of API driven technologies is going to federate this back, as Andy said, into the devices and into the hands and fingers of the people that can actually do things a little bit quicker. We are 1 minute from the end of the panel debate, and I know that people have probably had lunch and taken time out of their day to join us today. So I guess first and foremost, chaps, thanks very much. I think it's been a really, really positive conversation. There was one question that came through, and if we have got time to answer it, I'll just ask it. But one of the questions there was, analysts are typically predicting that data is moving further out of the core, so out of that DC and the cloud, and moving more towards regional edge type locations or kind of caching capabilities. And that's pretty much as a result of COVID. Are you seeing that pattern in your respective customers or your industries at the moment? Is that something that you're seeing?
Yes, I'd say. I mean, there's legislation that involves, it's hard to hold customer data actually. And so one technique is not to let the customers hold it themselves. And then that's actually probably a fair setup. You see the track and trace that I don't know if you know Nearform, a good mate of mine runs Nearform, and they've done a fantastic job in Ireland with how they've dealt with the track and trace app there. And that's actually one of the tenets is keep the data on the phone and don't share it into a central, something we didn't do very well in our country over here. So I think from a privacy perspective, if you've got it on your device, that's about as secure as you can hope perhaps, maybe as far as I can think anyway. So yes, I think there is a trend for this, and rightly so. People want to, you know, be a bit more control of their data. I mean, we're not very well in control of our data though. I mean, at the moment, so it's a long journey to get it back out of the hands of the companies that are really making the money out of that data.
Yeah, the kind of the data sprawl and the data duplication piece is probably why the data is growing 5 times, right? Over the next 5 years. We haven't had any other questions come through, but is there anything that any of our panel want to bookend in terms of those comments from Roy? If there's nothing further from anybody, I think I'll hand back to Marius in order to close out today's panel debate. Marius, back to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ben. So yeah, thanks again to all of our panelists. And yeah, thanks, Ben, for facilitating. I think it's a really, really interesting discussion. We have recorded the event. So what I'll do after this, I'll share a link just via the different meetup groups. So you can kind of share that with any colleagues or anyone that haven't been able to make it today. And in terms of the next event, that is TBC. So we actually are looking for kind of speakers and topics for our next Leaders in Tech event. So if you are kind of interested in being involved in a panel discussion, or you want to kind of talk about a particular subject, then please do reach out to me via LinkedIn or Meetup. Yeah, because it'd be great to kind of discuss that further. But thanks again. And yeah, no doubt see everyone again soon.
Perfect. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.